The year was 1944. Europe was burning. For 5 long years, the world had been trapped in the most brutal war humanity had ever seen. World War II. Cities had fallen, families were torn apart, millions were gone, and the world seemed lost in darkness. But in the West, across the Atlantic Ocean, a new hope was rising. The United States of America had joined the fight. They had the weapons, they had the soldiers, they had the spirit to win. Yet, to defeat Adolf Hitler's Germany, strength alone was not enough. They needed something the enemy could not predict, something unseen. By early 1944, the Allied forces had a plan, a secret plan, that would change the course of the war. It was called Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. This would later be known as D-Day. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would cross the English Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy. It was the most dangerous operation in the entire war. But the German army was watching. Their spies were everywhere, in the skies, on the sea, listening to every radio message. They knew the Allies would attack soon, but they didn't know where or when. The Allies had to make sure that Germany looked in the wrong direction. So, someone in the US Army came up with a strange idea. A wild, impossible idea. What if they could fool the enemy? What if they could make the Germans believe there was a giant army in one place, when in truth there was nothing there at all? An army made not of soldiers, but of illusions. An army that could appear and disappear at will. An army of ghosts. The US Army began to search for people who could make this dream come true. Not ordinary soldiers, but people with imagination. Artists, painters, designers, sound experts, actors, architects. These men were not chosen for their strength, but for their creativity. They were told, "You will go to the front lines, but you will not shoot. You will fight with deception. Your weapon is your mind." And so, in a quiet camp in Maryland, the US Army created a new and secret unit. It was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Only a few officers knew its real purpose. Even among soldiers, whispers spread. Who are those men? What do they do? No one really knew. But these 1,100 men would go on to perform one of the most extraordinary missions in all of military history. They would become the Ghost Army. Their training was like no other. While other units fired rifles, they practiced painting camouflage. While others studied maps for attack routes, they studied the shapes of shadows, how light fell on a tank, how sound traveled in fog. They learned how to make a tank look real from the sky, even if it was made of rubber. They learned how to make fake radio messages sound authentic. They learned how to use sound effects to make it seem like a whole army was moving at night. To them, the battlefield was a stage. Every explosion, every movement, every sound, it was part of a giant performance meant to trick the enemy. At first, even some generals laughed at the idea. An army of artists, inflatable tanks, fake radio calls, it sounded like a cartoon. But then, a few wise commanders realized the truth. Deception could save lives. If they could trick the Germans into attacking the wrong place, they could protect the real soldiers. Every fake tank could mean one less grave. Every false message could save hundreds of lives. This was not just about art. It was about strategy, courage, and sacrifice. Their first mission was small, testing equipment, learning to work together. They practiced building fake camps, lighting fake fires, and creating illusions at night. They painted fake shadows on the ground. They placed dummy soldiers made of wood. They even practiced driving trucks in circles to make the roads look busy. At night, from the air, it looked like an entire division was camped there. But in truth, only a handful of men were moving the props. Soon, their skills would be tested for real. The Allies were ready to begin the liberation of Europe, and the Ghost Army would be sent to France, into the heart of war. They would face danger, bombs, and enemy scouts. If caught, they had no heavy weapons to defend themselves. They carried pistols, but their main tools were air pumps, paintbrushes, and sound equipment. They were not there to fight. They were there to pretend. But pretending in a war zone was just as deadly as fighting. As they boarded the ships to cross the English Channel, many of them were nervous, not just because of the enemy, but because of the unknown. They were entering a new kind of battle, a psychological one. They were not just fighting men, they were fighting minds. It was June 1944. The beaches of Normandy were covered with smoke, fire, and chaos. The D-Day landings had begun. Thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the coast of France, fighting through bullets, barbed wire, and deadly mines. The liberation of Europe had started, but for the Ghost Army, the battle was not about fighting. It was about pretending. They arrived in France not long after D-Day. Their orders were clear: to confuse the enemy, to mislead their intelligence, and to protect real Allied divisions by creating fake ones. In the early morning, a small group of American trucks rolled into a French field. Local villagers watched with curiosity. They expected tanks, guns, cannons. Instead, they saw men pulling out giant rubber sheets. At first, it looked like a joke. But soon, those rubber sheets began to take shape, large, heavy forms filled with air, until they looked like tanks. From a distance, they seemed completely real. The sunlight hit their metal-colored paint just right. Even the shadows looked natural. The Ghost Army had just created its first inflatable army. The idea was simple but powerful. A real tank was too heavy to move easily, but a rubber tank made of air could be lifted by 4 men. In a few hours, the Ghost Army could build an entire fake armored division. Hundreds of tanks, jeeps, artillery guns, even fake airplanes. From the sky, German pilots would report what they saw. Enemy tanks near the forest, American forces gathering. But what they didn't know was that all those tanks were balloons. The soldiers worked like stagehands in a theater. Some inflated tanks, others painted them to match the real army's design. They even added fake tire marks on the ground to make the illusion stronger. When night came, they lit fake campfires and headlights. From a distance, it looked like thousands of soldiers resting before battle, but in truth, only about 100 men were there. To make the illusion complete, they also needed sound. For this, they brought huge speakers mounted on trucks. They recorded the real sounds of tanks, trucks, and soldiers, and then played them at full volume. The sound could travel up to 15 miles. To German spies listening in the dark, it sounded like a full division on the move. The Ghost Army had learned how to turn sound into a weapon, but the deception didn't stop there. The third part of their trick was radio. They created fake radio networks, operators who sent endless coded messages between each other, mimicking the real communication style of other divisions. If the enemy intercepted these signals, they would believe a massive American force was stationed nearby. Every radio message, every fake conversation, was carefully planned like a script, part of a massive performance on the stage of war. The Ghost Army's first mission in France was called Operation Brest. The German forces were still strong in the area. Their goal was to draw German attention away from real troops preparing for a major attack. The Ghost soldiers set up their inflatable tanks in open fields, placed fake artillery guns along the roads, and started broadcasting fake radio signals. They even used dummy soldiers, uniforms stuffed with straw, to look like real men. From the air, it looked perfect. The Germans took the bait. They sent scouts to watch the area. Reports reached their high command that a large American force was preparing to strike. In truth, the real attack was happening many miles away, where the Germans had now weakened their defense. The plan worked. The Ghost Army had saved hundreds of lives with nothing but rubber, paint, and sound. But it was not easy. Their missions were dangerous. They often operated close to enemy lines, sometimes only a few miles away from real German troops. If they were discovered, they had no heavy weapons to fight back. They could only run or hide. One member of the Ghost Army later said, "We were pretending to be heroes, but some days we forgot we were pretending." The French weather was harsh. Rain turned the fields into swamps. Inflatable tanks collapsed in the wind. Sometimes they had to re-inflate them over and over again just to keep the illusion alive. But the Ghost soldiers kept going. They believed in their mission to protect others by being invisible heroes. Their work was secret. No medals, no fame. Only the satisfaction of knowing that their tricks saved lives. In villages, people often saw them moving silently at night, dragging strange shapes, whispering, and then disappearing before dawn. To the locals, they seemed like ghosts themselves. That's how they earned their name, the Ghost Army. They were there, and then gone. Appearing in one place today, another place tomorrow, always confusing, always unseen. As their operations continued, their confidence grew. They began to test new techniques, mixing light, shadow, sound, and art like no army had ever done before. And soon, their biggest challenge would come, a mission so risky that even their commanders hesitated. It would take place in the heart of France as the Allied forces pushed toward Germany itself. This mission would prove once and for all that deception could be stronger than firepower. The Ghost Army was ready for its most daring performance yet, one that would turn the tide of the war and write their names quietly into the pages of history. By the end of 1944, the war in Europe was changing. The Allied forces had broken through France and were pushing closer to Germany. Hitler's army was retreating, but not without a fight. Every town, every river, every bridge was defended fiercely. The Germans knew they were losing, but they were not ready to give up. And in that chaos, the Ghost Army was given its most dangerous task yet. A mission so bold that if it failed, thousands of real soldiers could die. The operation was called Operation Viersen. It took place in March 1945 near the Rhine River, just weeks before the war in Europe would end. The Rhine was Germany's last natural barrier. If the Allies crossed it, the road to Berlin would be open, but the crossing had to be a surprise. If the Germans discovered the real location, they would destroy the bridges and flood the area with troops. That's where the Ghost Army came in. Their job was to make the Germans believe the main crossing would happen 25 miles away from the real one. It was a master plan. The real American Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine near Wesel. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army would pretend to be a massive force near Viersen, just a few miles north. Their mission: to fool the enemy's eyes and ears, to make them believe that the attack was coming from the wrong direction. They had to create a show so convincing that even experienced German scouts would believe it. The Ghost Army began their work. In the cover of darkness, trucks rolled into open fields near Viersen. The men set up inflatable tanks, jeeps, and artillery guns, hundreds of them, spread across miles of farmland. They placed fake barbed wire, dummy aircraft, and fake bridges built from wood and rope. From the sky, it looked like a real army preparing for battle. Next came the sound crews. They set up their powerful loudspeakers and began to play recorded sounds of tanks moving, bulldozers digging, and soldiers shouting. They changed the sound patterns every few hours so that German spies would think the army was moving around. The sound carried through the cold night air, echoing across the fields and rivers. It sounded real. It sounded like war. Meanwhile, the radio deception teams went to work. They created fake networks that mimicked real army divisions, sending coded messages, pretending to be high-ranking officers, and communicating with each other in perfect military rhythm. Even the German radio intercept units believed the messages were real. Every detail was planned, from the number of fake vehicles to the names painted on their trucks. The Ghost Army had become masters of deception, but they were still in danger. They were only a few miles away from real German units. If caught, they had no real tanks to defend themselves. They had only pistols and air pumps. One soldier later said, "If the Germans had attacked us, we would have been finished in 15 minutes. But still, they carried on, because they knew that every minute of confusion could save hundreds of lives elsewhere. The illusion was working. German scouts began to report heavy American troop movement near Viersen. Enemy radio messages confirmed it. They believed a major attack was about to begin there. German forces were redirected to defend Viersen. Tanks and soldiers were moved north, away from the real crossing point at Wesel. And while the Ghost Army played their part in the dark, the real Ninth Army quietly crossed the Rhine, almost unopposed. The deception had worked perfectly. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, the Allied forces were already across the river. The war in Europe was nearly over. Operation Viersen was the Ghost Army's final and greatest success. It was their last and most perfect illusion. They had performed more than 20 major deceptions during the war. In France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They had tricked German commanders, spies, and even pilots. They had saved thousands of Allied lives without ever firing a shot. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army quietly returned home. No parades, no headlines. Their mission was still classified, a secret even to their families. For decades, no one knew what they had done. Their records were hidden, their stories untold. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years later, that the Ghost Army's existence was made public. Historians and journalists began to uncover the truth. People were amazed. An army of artists and engineers had fooled one of the most powerful military forces in history. They had turned war into art, and art into a weapon. One of the soldiers, Seymour Nussenbaum, later said, "We didn't carry guns to kill, we carried paint to protect." Another, Arthur Shillstone, remembered, "We weren't heroes in the normal sense, but we were proud that our trick saved real soldiers from dying." These men were painters, designers, radio operators, sound engineers, and every one of them played a part in one of the greatest illusions ever made. For many years, the Ghost Army remained in the shadows of history, but today, their story is finally known, a story of courage, imagination, and quiet heroism. They proved that in war, sometimes creativity is as powerful as courage, and imagination can be as strong as steel. They called themselves the Ghost Army. They fought without killing, they won without firing, and they saved lives with nothing but air, sound, and art. This was not just a story about war. It was a story about the power of the human mind to create, to protect, and to dream, even in the darkest of times. In August 1944, the Ghost Army received one of its biggest and most dangerous missions. The target, the French port city of Brest. The Germans had turned Brest into a fortress. Thousands of enemy soldiers were hidden in bunkers, waiting to stop the Allied advance. The mission was simple but risky: make the Germans believe a huge American army was moving toward Brest from the east. But in truth, there were only a few hundred men from the Ghost Army. The team started working in the dark of night. They brought inflatable tanks, rubber jeeps, fake cannons, and even dummy airplanes. They placed them carefully on the open fields near the main road, visible to German scouts watching through binoculars. To make the illusion stronger, the sound crew set up giant loudspeakers. They played recordings of tanks starting their engines, soldiers shouting orders, and heavy machinery moving. The sounds echoed through the valleys and villages, but that was not enough. The Ghost Army also used spoof radio. Operators sent false messages, pretending to be real divisions of the U.S. Army. German intelligence picked up those signals and believed them. One German officer later said, "We were sure there were at least 2 American divisions coming for us. We prepared for battle, but they never came." For days, the Germans waited. They shifted troops, moved tanks, and even redirected their artillery, all because of the fake army that didn't exist. During that time, real Allied units quietly advanced from another direction. The Ghost Army had pulled off a perfect illusion, one that saved thousands of lives by avoiding a deadly direct attack. But not every deception was safe. Sometimes German artillery fired on the fake camps. The inflatable tanks would burst, soldiers would have to run, and they risked being discovered. Yet they never stopped, because every hour they fooled the enemy, real soldiers somewhere else survived. The men of the Ghost Army didn't carry heavy weapons. They carried brushes, radios, and rubber tanks. Their fight wasn't with bullets, it was with imagination. And in Brest, their imagination became a shield that protected thousands. But their journey was far from over. The biggest and most dangerous mission was yet to come, the deception at the Rhine River. By March 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its final and most dangerous stage. The Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany, and the next big challenge stood in front of them. The Rhine River, a wide, powerful river that separated the Allied troops from the heart of Germany. Crossing the Rhine was a huge risk. If the Germans knew where the Allies would cross, they could prepare their defenses and kill thousands. So once again, the Ghost Army was called into action. Their mission, to make the Germans believe the crossing would happen in one place, while the real crossing would take place miles away. Meanwhile, the sound engineers rolled out their secret weapon, the sonic deception. Massive speakers hidden behind bushes and trees played the sounds of tanks rolling, soldiers shouting, and metal clanking. It was so real that people miles away believed a full army was there. The Germans saw everything from the air, and they fell for it. They moved heavy guns and troops toward Wesel, preparing for an attack that would never come. While they watched the fake army, the real U.S. divisions crossed the Rhine quietly at a different point, almost without resistance. It was another perfect illusion, one that helped speed up the end of the war. But for the men of the Ghost Army, the mission wasn't without danger. German artillery occasionally shelled the fake positions. Sometimes they came close enough that the men had to hide in ditches or run through muddy fields. Private Jack Maisie, one of the Ghost soldiers, later said, "We didn't have guns to fight back. Our weapon was our art and our courage was in pretending." When the real Allied troops finally crossed the Rhine, the deception had worked perfectly. The Ghost Army had again played its invisible role, unseen, uncredited, but vital. Their creativity had saved thousands of soldiers' lives and helped bring the Allies one step closer to victory. They were soldiers who painted battlefields, who sculpted tanks, who broadcast illusions, men who risked their lives not by fighting, but by pretending. But after victory came silence. Their story vanished into classified files locked away for decades, until years later, the truth finally came to light. The guns of World War II finally fell silent in May 1945. Germany had surrendered. The world began to breathe again. But while soldiers everywhere returned home as heroes, the men of the Ghost Army went home in silence. They could not tell their families what they had done. They could not show their sketches, their maps, or their photographs. Their mission, their entire existence, was still top secret. Many of them went on to live normal lives. Some became famous artists and designers. Others became teachers, photographers, and filmmakers. One of them, Bill Blass, would later become one of America's top fashion designers. Another, Art Kane, became a world-famous photographer. But none of them forgot what they had done. They remembered the nights when they pretended to be entire armies. The nights when fake tanks rolled through real danger. And the fear that came with knowing, if the enemy ever discovered the truth, they would all die. In 1945, the Ghost Army was officially disbanded. The soldiers were told to go home and forget everything. No one outside the military even knew they existed. Years passed, then decades. Files sat hidden in government archives. The world moved on, from one war to another. But the story of the Ghost Army stayed buried under dust and silence. Then, in the early 1990s, something changed. Historians and journalists began discovering strange old photos. Tanks made of rubber, trucks that looked fake, and soldiers posing beside inflatable weapons. At first, people thought it was a joke. But when more files were declassified, the truth came out. The Ghost Army was real. and its impact on World War II was far greater than anyone had imagined. These artists and dreamers had fooled one of the most powerful armies in the world, using nothing but sound, paint, and creativity. Their courage had saved thousands of lives. Their imagination had helped win a war. But now, after half a century of silence, it was time for their story to finally be told. For decades they were shadows. Now they would become legends.